Well, the convoluted setup that the tech people gave me yesterday didn't work, so we're just going to use like FaceTime on the computer because why not?
All right.
All right.
Okay, I just kind of reformatted it for the audience. I wrote an abstract.
Because I was reading the time thing. I was actually on like the programming committee. And I was reading that.
Good. Ben hit me up. I was like, just like talking about stuff. So it was good, but also I was like, I haven't talked to him. I have to talk to him about that.
Yeah, that's.
So it was like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, too much talking to you and people.
Yeah. But it was really good. Very
Cool.
stimulating.
Yes. That's great. I think Ben said he would be through. I don't know if he was just checking out the room or.
Well, he's heard me talk about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's good.
Okay.
It's a pretty good niche. It's not too narrow.
Possibly working on the slides from his stuff.
Right. Yeah. I think he's gonna. Yeah. He might have been checking
Yeah, and
out
having him like actually informed.
just to set up since I think this is where he's gonna be.
Right, yeah. This is the
Mm.
Yeah.
Is Edgar here?
Edgar's here.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Then it just not They're all, I think I'm most fascinated.
Oh wow.
You get like a long speech. Others. I mean, it's a good one for because everyone is just.
All right, thank you everybody for joining. We're going to get started. This is the Regional Game Development Panel. A wonderful, diverse array of approaches to looking at that. We have 3 different speakers with us here today. If you had looked at the website, you might have noticed one of the presenters is different from who we actually have here today. We had planned to have Mahdi Bahrami join us from, he's a developer from Iran, would have been coming here from Holland. He was unfortunately unable to get a visa. And so very late cancellation there, unfortunately. But the fortunate side of the coin there is that we are able to have Edgar Serrano Rivera join us in his stead, and Edgar has very interesting things to talk about as well. Our first speaker today will be Jaroslav Svelch. Joins us from Charles University in Prague. He started playing games on the East German Robotron machine in the 1980s. Worked as he was a Fulbright visiting researcher at the MIT Game Lab, formerly known as Gambit, a few years back. He works on local histories of computer games and social uses of digital technologies. We have as well Sagan Yee from Toronto. She's an animator, event facilitator, and occasional indie game perpetrator. She was a participant and later coordinator of the Difference Engine Initiative, where she made her first computer game. And she currently runs the Game Curious program for the Hand-Eye Society, and is a community member of Dames Making Games, awesome Toronto organization. So, Sagan, and we have Edgar Serrano Rivera. He is co-founder of Lienzo, a Chihuahua, Mexico-based game studio, and we'll be speaking about regional game dev from that perspective. So, without further ado, please.
Jaroslav. Okay, thanks for the introduction. So I'm a video game, computer game, or digital game scholar and historian. I hope this is not going to be too boring, so I'll show some videos and some images. And I mostly want to talk about the historical perspective on diversity, because in the history there has been a lot of diversity that's sometimes forgotten when we read, sort of the canonical stories of how games developed over the years. I will look at the example of Czechoslovakia, which is the country that I was born in, but which no longer exists. And I'll show you how sort of regional game development, local game development developed in that particular country. This is an image from this game, Tetris 2. As you can see the slogan. From Czechoslovakia comes the ultimate version of Soviet computer game. So you can see there was actually a lot of exchange between different countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's interesting to look at this locally and sort of compare it to other places. So usually when you read about video game histories, or especially here in the US, the narratives are very much centered on companies like Atari. Then you have stories about game development in Japan and companies like Nintendo, and quite often these histories just sort of chronicle the firsts. What was the first real-time strategy game? They chronicle the successes of the global game industry. They focus on great men, the people you read about usually male. That you read about in video game histories like these. They focus on canonical titles, the games that we all are supposed to know, and then the question is where is the diversity? And I want to show that there actually was a lot of diversity in where games were being produced. And as an example, I use this particular platform. This is a computer called the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. It was manufactured in the UK, and it was one of the most popular platforms in Central and Eastern Europe, and also some parts of Western Europe, and also some parts of Latin America. And if you there's this is an amazing archive of games that were produced for this computer. The computer was introduced in 1982, and so his commercial lifespan was pretty much until late 80s, maybe early 90s. And if you look at the archive, you can sort of list the games based on country of origin. And this is a really interesting thing to do, because you can see that there's a total of 14,000 games for this machine, out of which 9,600 are made in the UK, which kind of makes sense because that's where the computer was produced. But if you go further, you can see that there's about a third of the, one-fifth of those was made in Spain, which is another huge base of this computer. And sometimes people talk about the golden era of the Spanish game development, which occurred in the 1980s and early 90s.
Still 89.
Until 99?
Until 89.
Until 89. So in the 80s. Thank you, Clara. Italy, there are some games made in Italy. Czechoslovakia, which is the case I will be talking about, and you can see that more games were made for this computer there than in Germany, which is obviously a much bigger country. Poland had some games. I'm just choosing. I'm not actually listing all the countries. Choosing some of them. The USA only produced 19 games for the Spectrum computer, which is an interesting case because usually, that's where that's the sort of dominant producer of video games. Japan only 3 games, and I actually look at them. They actually were made in Japan for this British computer, which is just one more than games that were made in Iceland for this computer. So yeah, you can see that there is a diversity in places of production, and I'm going to be talking about Czechoslovakia specifically. And this is sort of just to sum up in a way. I'm actually writing this history. I'm writing a book on history of games in Czechoslovakia, and sort of like more generally behind the Iron Curtain. And when you want to do that, you sort of have to rely a lot on interviews, actually meeting people who were active in the 1980s and 90s. Try to look for archival material and also games. And what's interesting and what's actually very useful is that there's a lot of fans of sort of local development communities, and they have been gathering pieces of software and putting it online on these like privately run sort of digital archives. So that's a big help. Something about Czechoslovakia, I think it's important to note like how this specific context was different from places where sort of the more popular histories were taking place. So it's a country that was behind the Iron Curtain, which meant that sort of the movement of goods and ideas was to a certain extent limited, especially goods, especially machines, especially hardware. So it was not really that easy to actually travel into the West from Czechoslovakia. You had to have a special permit. Not everybody had that, so there were difficulties. There were restrictions on imports of technology, and which made it very difficult to actually buy a computer. There was no hardware market until like 1987 or 9. It's which meant that you couldn't just like go into a store and buy a computer. It was pretty difficult. Like you had to have somebody who could travel abroad and bring it to you, or there was a gray market. There were many difficulties with that as well, and there was no software market. So you couldn't sell anything that you make for the Spectrum computer or any other computer. The local communities sort of shared the things that they produced. So yeah, there was no money to make off of creating games. Some computers were designed and manufactured in the country. These are some of them. They were mostly used in schools, so you wouldn't be able to buy them in a store. But what happened was that most people actually imported computers, like this one, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, which was the most popular one. And in the mid '80s, there was already reportedly 10,000 users, and by the end of the decade, it was tens of thousands. These figures are all kind of very hypothetical. Like nobody really counted them, but this is what the estimates were at the time. So this was the most popular computer there. It's very small. It's like this big. So it was pretty easy to smuggle it into the country. And I heard this one story, and I'm actually not sure if it's apocryphal. It might be that somebody just packed the Spectrum so that it looked like a sandwich, so that they would be let into the country with the Spectrum. It was legal to import it, but there were enormous customs fees. So people were trying to avoid that. Most of the development took place at people's homes and in computer clubs, which were often affiliated with sort of state-controlled and state-run organizations. One of them was the Station of Young Technicians in Prague. And here you can see one of the most prolific authors of games in Czechoslovakia, František Fuka, on the left, who's showing his friends at the Station of Young Technicians his own new creation, a computer game. This is from 1986, it's a newspaper clipping, and you can see that like these kids are kind of in awe, like what's happening on the screen. Fuka is obviously the older one, have already made some games. You can also notice that there are no girls here, and unfortunately this was very similar to the West. Computer hobby was considered a very male thing. It was defined as a male activity, so that's in that regard that was similar to what was happening here. 2 years later, Fuka described the scene. So there were people making games in sort of very different conditions. The few individuals that make games in our country can naturally hardly compete with teams of specialists for whom making games is not only fun but also a job. One person can hardly be a good author of a game idea, a programmer, a graphic artist, a musician, and also have enough time to pull it off. And I think this sort of also relates to like what we hear from indie developers now, and like indie game the movie. I think people they would probably say like something very similar. So it was a very different context, but I think the things that they went through were relatable. And I actually want to show you this little piece of video that's from a film documentary about computers. And oh wait, this is Edgar's video. Sorry. Sort of just shows who was making games and where. It's an interview. Well, it's a film about games which features Fuka, the guy I just mentioned. It's from 1986.
Já si taky dělám vlastní programy a
František Fuka, 16 let, student.
někdy používám teda hudbu jako už hotovou, nějaký klasiky, třeba Bacha, takhle. Někdy si udělám nějakou vlastní melodii, ale už si myslím teda také nutný, abych si ji zahrál na klavír. Tím zjistím, co to je vlastně za tóny a pak ji převedu do čísel na ten počítač. Převádí se tím způsobem, že C je 0 a potom po půltónech 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Máš napsaný úkoly?
Františkova matka.
Učebnice nachystaný? Nádoby za tebe utřela. Jana, tady máš bundu, nejpozději za 10 minut to vypneš a půjdeš nejméně na půl hodiny na procházku.
So that was like a snapshot from the life of a game developer in Czechoslovakia. So you could see their time and their work was also structured by a family, his mother, so on. This is an image of him working at his computer. You can see the spectrum here. It's a very tiny machine. Yeah. So what games were being made? Many of them were sort of clones and copies of Western stuff, and quite often people would make them to impress, their peers, to show how well they can program this stuff. The games were mostly targeted at the local community, so there was no idea no plans of just selling it, abroad or anything. It was mostly for people who knew or people that they wanted to get in touch by just sort of passing the games around. Games were distributed mostly on cassette tapes. There was sort of this informal distribution network, or sneaker, we could say, mostly cassette games. So shooter games, trying to sort of approximate Western genres. This is an example of sort of the Czech version of English. Game over, you are death. Always lost poor. That's what happens when in this game you die, and you die a lot. But also people were sort of addressing their own communities by making games like text adventures, because only few people in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s could actually read English, there was this niche suddenly appeared that people could sort of achieve something in. They could create text adventures that were inspired by British or American text adventures, but they were in Czech, so people would be able to read them. And these sometimes featured Western inspirations, such as a series of games about Indiana Jones, text adventures in Czech, of course, unlicensed and totally. It was sort of like a fan fiction. I wonder what George Lucas would have to say about that. He's notorious for copyright litigation. But there were also games that were based on sort of local culture, like locally produced comics. Rychlé šípy was one of the most popular comic series about these 5 boys that go on adventures. It started this comic started coming out in the 1930s already, and was very popular. So yeah, there was a text adventure about that as well. Some other interesting subgenres that could be considered specific to that context were games in ordinary settings. That was sort of like a common thing to do for developers to just make a game and set it in your apartment, or set it in a sort of apartment building somewhere in your city, and the game would feature your friends or your acquaintances. It was a pretty common thing to do, as if games were this medium that was very accessible. Like it was the first thing you could it was a creative outlet for many people, and it was very accessible in a way that everybody who had a computer could just like start and write a game in BASIC, text adventure. These were mostly text adventures. Hacking games, that's another specific genre that was popular. There was around 25 games being made in this genre. And how this works, do you know Uplink, the indie game? It's something very similar. So you're sort of controlling a simulation of a computer which is inside of your computer, basically. So you have an operating system, and you're trying to, most of the time, you're trying to hack into other computers, break codes, solve puzzles in order to win some money, get some money, and so on. So this is a genre that in the 1980s did appear in the West, but wasn't nearly as popular. But we can get back to the questions. There were games that were intended as protest against the communist regime. There was a handful of them, mostly released anonymously, and one of them actually is a continuation of the Indiana Jones theme. There's a game about Indiana Jones in Madison Square. He actually takes part in one of the demonstrations against the communist regime in 1989. And what you, as Indiana Jones, have to do in the game is basically to like brutally kill the members of the state police who were in real life. Actually, the demonstration was very brutally suppressed by the police. So this was sort of like a revenge against what happened on Madison Square. And there were more of these sort of leading up to the Velvet Revolution. And this happened quite often. Once again, we can see that games were quite an accessible means of expression of one's thoughts and opinions and experiences. Things changed a little bit after the Velvet Revolution, as I said, because suddenly there was a market. So before we had a local community, and now we have a local market, and people were, of course, Western games could come into the country, and they did, and people were playing them, but also local developers were making local games for local people. Many of them were adventure games. Once again, because of the language barrier, it was difficult for people to play them in English. This series called Polda is like a series of cop comedy point-and-click adventure games which had sustained success and had voiceovers from some of the very popular Czech comedians. Guka and Dragon is sort of other games that were sort of based on Czech children's books. So that was something that happened quite often. Games developed for the local market. However, in the late 90s, there started to be this pressure on production value, and that was sort of something that happened everywhere. Suddenly, the budgets were rising, and it wouldn't really pay to just make games for local market because the market is pretty small. So people started developing some new IPs that would be then sold in other markets. Either the sort of European budget market, which was a big thing, and it still pretty much is. Games that are sold on DVDs in stores, in convenience stores or in supermarkets. So that's a really interesting sort of thing to look at as well. But also games that were intended to be sold in the US and all over the world. So Black Mirror is sort of an adventure game franchise that was started there, and Mafia is action game franchise that was started in the Czech Republic as well. But the thing sort of to consider when we're trying to critically think about diversity and local diversity or regional diversity in games is to what extent are these games really local? Like how does that translate into the content? And quite often you can see that there are many games being made that are sort of just outsourced into other regions, and I think that happens. I'm sure that happens all over the world. So you have a game like Silent and Downpour, which was developed in Brno, Czech Republic, but I mean the screenplay was pretty much done by Konami, and the people in the Czech Republic were pretty much just workers trying to make that thing happen. Also, you might probably know that DayZ is being developed in the Czech Republic, but what they also do is the same company, Bohemia Interactive. They make military simulations, such as the Virtual Battlefield System 3. It's the flagship of the US Army's Games for Training program. So the question is, how is this game local? How can we think about this game as being local? Local people work on it, but does it really bear any traces of the culture where it's coming from? That's a question for sort of local game studies to ask. Thank you. But at the same time, this is a Polish game, it's not a Czech game, but at the same time, there is a way in which local and regional development can sort of appeal to a global audience while maintaining some of its roots in local cultures. The Witcher series is an example. Like it's a huge RPG franchise now that's based on the work of the Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, and it sort of introduced this series, which is very much based on Slavic sort of mythology, to the Western audiences, and it is appealing in a way that sort of Japanese mythology was appealing to people who were playing Japanese role-playing games. Also, a number of indie developers sort of are taking advantage of the tradition of Czech animation, sort of to appeal to the international audience by the virtue of being different, having different sorts of inspiration, such as the films by Jiří Trnka from the 1960s and 70s, one of the most famous and amazing Czech illustrators and animators. So yeah, so my main points that I was trying to convey here was one of them. There has been a lot of diversity, but sometimes it's just been forgotten, and I think that it's up to game historians to sort of like uncover these histories and uncover this diversity that's been there. Also, we have seen these shifts in terms of audiences. So as I said, like at first, quite often the target audience was the local community. Then we had local markets, regional markets, and now quite often it has shifted to sort of global audiences that are sort of dispersed and not really sort of have the same shared knowledge of cultures and experiences anymore. And a question I kind of want to throw out is, what really constitutes regional or local content, and how we can look at it, in terms of power. There is local development, but still, the decisions are being made, in company headquarters in, maybe Japan, it might be in the US or in Germany, and quite often the people who work in that country are just people who are doing their, just providing the labor, basically. So yeah, that was from me. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Jaroslav. It's wonderful.
Just grab my water bottle. So my talk is going to be pretty different, but also touch on like similar themes. There's this typo on this slide. You may notice it says iToronto. It's not like an iPad joke or something. It's because my original pitch to different games was I was just going to talk about the program I run in Toronto called Game Curious, and then I got put on this panel that was about regional game development, and I was like, I'm not really an expert on Toronto, but I can speak from my own like personal experience, so I added Toronto in brackets, but I misspelled it. So that was off to a good start. This is from, I pulled the population off Wikipedia. I think it's pretty accurate, but like, so Canada, like one of the biggest cities in North America. It's in Ontario, population about 2.8 million, and these are three of our terrible nicknames that nobody ever actually uses. Hogtown people like to use ironically because it sounds terrible. So when I was asked to do, when I found out that I was going to be on this panel, I was kind of like, well, like I'm going to be presenting this in New York, and Toronto's like not that different from New York compared to the other people that are on this panel. Like it's not like Iran where I would expect there would be like a bigger difference. But then I started sort of, you know, thinking about it more and like talking to people like about, you know, what's the game scene like in where you're from. And I was like, no, there actually like are some significant differences, or at least interesting differences. So for just like some background information about me, I'm not from Toronto originally. I'm from Saskatchewan, which is like 2 provinces over from Ontario. And my background's in animation. I went to school for animation in Ontario, and that's how I ended up in Toronto. And I went to this game making initiative aimed at women called the Difference Engine Initiative, and it was put on by the Hand-Eye Society, who I now currently work for. And it's Hand-Eye Society. They just celebrated their 5th anniversary recently. They're a nonprofit arts and culture organization. And 5 years is pretty old by video game arts and culture organization standards, because that whole idea hasn't been around for too long. And so it's like different from artist collectives, which like there are a lot of game artist collectives, but I think like not too many nonprofit arts organizations, which is kind of cool. So I got involved through the game making workshop in 2011, and then they asked me to coordinate the second one. So they ran it again. These were like 6-week workshops. And then since then, I've been doing a lot of workshops. I also make my own games. This was the first game that I made through the workshop. And then a lot of experimental, sort of site-specific stuff. This was a game where you cheated on your boyfriend and you have to throw knives at the screen, and it's like sort of like weird peripheral stuff. Another of the participants also in that first session, there were 6 of us. There was me, also Zoe Quinn was one of the women, and she made her first game there as well. And Cecily Carver, who went on to co-found James Making Games, which has a pretty big presence in the indie games community in Toronto now. So a lot of stuff happened in that 6-week session. It was very interesting. I could write a whole book about what happened there. But the reason I bring it up is because that's kind of what Toronto game development means to me. Is it's a lot of people doing really cool things, and it's pretty easy to connect with people in Toronto. So my friend Yuna Lee, who also went through the program, she's a graphic designer, and she made this like beautiful diagram where it sort of charts everyone who went through the Difference Engine Initiative, and then other like game projects that they went on to do, and places that they ended up speaking at, and so on and so forth. So it kind of visually shows like a web of connections and people and projects, and showing basically the importance of these kind of initiatives and the importance of bringing people together in a physical space to work on things, and showing them how to create things. And so that brings me to Game Curious, which is the program I'm currently running for Hand-Eye Society. And I always pitch it as a book club with buttons. So it's a book club but with video games instead of books. And it's aimed at people who would not identify themselves as gamers, which is a super broad category. So it's not saying it's aimed at non-gamers, it's aimed at people who just wouldn't call themselves gamers for whatever reason. So some examples would be like artists, or activists, or journalists, or parents who want to know what their kid is doing in front of the screen all day. And it's a weekly program. The first time we ran it was in a place called the Academy of the Impossible, which doesn't really exist in a physical form anymore. But basically, we just set up games in a space and arranged by theme. And then the first hour is like people play the games. People come in and play the games for an hour, and then the second hour is we just sit around and discuss and talk about, you know, what did you get out of that experience, and like try and get them to like think critically about what they played, or that sort of thing. So yeah, that was what I just talked about. So these are some of some photos from the event. This was Johann Sebastian Joust with the PlayStation Move controllers. So we had people from the idea was that people from all different backgrounds and levels of play experience would be able to come in and feel comfortable exploring games in this context, which is super important because everyone's probably had this conversation where you talk to someone who is they're like, oh, what do you do? And you say, oh, I'm in video games. And they go oh, I don't play games, really. I just play Candy Crush. And they're really shy about it. And so we get a lot of, or you get people who are video games, aren't those kids are so addicted to those and stuff like that. So they're either really kind of don't want to talk about it, or they're kind of aggressive about it and asking you these loaded questions about video games' detrimental effect on society and stuff like that. And so the whole idea of Game Curious is to sort of break down those barriers of judgment and preconceived notions, not just from their side, but also from our side of being, you don't want to be super condescending about video games don't make people addicted and engage with them that way. It's to be we can both learn from each other. So there's we had someone bring in their Oculus Rift game that they were playing, and people were super excited about that because unless you're working in game development, you probably don't have an Oculus Rift lying around. So it's it's nice to. This was the some people got really into the program, and these were the people who would come every week, and they're just super excited about it because they really liked the inclusivity of the program, and it really was a place where they felt comfortable in a way that most events that are video games, we're all about the video games. They that were catering to gamers. These people would be I went to those events and I just didn't feel comfortable. But Game Curious is a place where people who do play games and people who don't play a lot of games but are interested in them can sort of come together on a level playing field. So that was the first time we ran it. The second year we ran it, we actually ran it in a public library. So it was a very different space because, well, it's a public library. So and it's Toronto's biggest library branch. So we had tons of people just streaming through, and so you pick up a lot more random passersby who are why is there an Xbox in the library? And they're really confused, and they'll come over and check it out, and then immediately you can start a conversation about why there's an Xbox in the library and why that's important. So that was with the Hand-Eye Society Art Starts. So Art Starts so I'm running the program again for the third time in a row, and again it's changed again completely. So this time we are partnering with Art Starts, which is arts-based community organization. They do a lot of work in sort of low-income communities and marginalized groups and at-risk youth and that sort of thing. So they'll have workshops for creative writing and hip hop and poetry slams and all these different creative mediums, right? And there's a lot of organizations that do that kind of work, but very few of them have video games as an added component of that. So that's kind of where Hand-Eye Society comes in, and it's kind of a cool partnership because Hand-Eye Society hasn't been around that long and also hasn't been doing that kind of work for very long, and Art Starts has been around for a while, but they don't have any video game experience. So it's you put those two things together, and it's a really good relationship for that reason. So we got some funding to have them as sort of a mentorship organization where they would be because you have to be sensitive when you're going into these areas and not just barging in being we're gonna do what we do and not have any feeling for the social context of what you're doing. And then we bring the equipment and obviously the curriculum and all that. And we also added to the play sessions another 6-week game making workshop. So the first 6 weeks are about playing the games, and then the next 6 weeks, if people really were excited about what they saw, now we show them how to actually make the game. So this is, now we're getting to like the more regional stuff, which is kind of like what this panel is all about. So this is an old slide from another talk, but I brought it up just because it kind of shows how things are laid out in Toronto. So Toronto is like New York, and it's very grid based. It's a pretty new city, so everything is like laid out in grids. And this third year, this is the first time that we're running the program outside of the downtown core. So this thing here is kind of like, like this kind of area here is the downtown core. And it's pretty easy to sort of get around. And then where we are this year it starts all the way up in Scarborough. And so when you talk to people about Scarborough and Toronto, EFAT knows what I'm talking about. You immediately get this reaction of like, oh, Scarborough, and people nickname it Scarberia because it's a wasteland that's like very far away, like Siberia, and it's like not a very nice joke, but that's like the impression that people have in their minds when you say Scarborough. It's like a suburban kind of sprawl. You'd have like food desert situations where you need a car to get around. And so it's pretty involved to like get to the downtown core by transit, unless you have a car and like someone willing to drive you. So that's kind of like, to me, having run this program for a couple years, the importance of having a physical space that's accessible to people is super, super important. So we would have people who came all the way from Scarborough just to come to Game Curious because they enjoyed it so much. And it's kind of like, but the mandate of the program is like, well, we should like be meeting them halfway at least or something. Like we can't always just say like, just come to us. You know, we're in the downtown and we're so important that like you should be coming all the way out from the outer limits of the city. So there is kind of like a culture war too going on between like, you know, the downtown elitists and then like the suburbs, which is like probably familiar to anyone who lives in like an urban area that's laid out like this. Game Curious 2.0. Okay, so I talked about this a bit. So I'm going to talk a bit about I mentioned that when I'm laying out the games that we play for each session, I usually break it up by theme. So you'd have like, you know, super weird and abstract games or like really artsy games, and then I had another session that was like political games and educational games. So we played Minecraft and Fate of the World, which is a global warming game, and like we sort of played it collectively and like talked about it. What were some of the other things? Like love, life, and relationships, because those are 3 words that people who come in thinking that games are either, you know, I haven't played games since the Atari or Call of Duty and Halo. So we get a lot of people who want to see like what else is out there, and so like breaking down by theme makes it easier for them to sort of like understand what the range of things are. But I always lead off the first session because the first session is kind of like people's first impression of the program, so you want to kind of put your best foot forward. So I came up with the idea that I would lead the first session with games that are set in Toronto. And there's a lot of games that are made in Toronto, so there's a kind of a difference. Games made in Toronto and games set in Toronto are like a super, those are 2 different things. Because Toronto has a lot of game development people in it and like a lot of companies. So we've got like, you know, Ubisoft is there, a lot of like mobile people, a lot of indies. But the games that they make are not necessarily about Toronto or like reflect Toronto. So when I have the first session, the games that are set in Toronto, it's like wow, I didn't even know that there were such a thing, because I'm used to games, and I realized coming here that it's different for Torontonians than it would be for like New Yorkers, because if you present like games that are set in New York, it's like there's a lot more options, and it's also not that big a deal because there's so like New York is very prominent in a lot of storytelling media, whereas Toronto, we often are disguised as New York or some other big city because, Pacific Rim, RoboCop, and like all these like shows are shot in downtown Toronto or Tokyo, but it's not actually set in Toronto. They're just making us look like, trying to make us look like New York or whatever. So we have a huge inferiority complex. And so Scott Pilgrim versus the World is like probably the most sort of blockbustery, well-known example of a game that's set in Toronto. But I like to also, like Castle Loma and like the CN Tower, obviously. So that's like kind of an obvious example. I really like to show this game called Snow because all it is you play this young woman with kind of low self-esteem and you work at a bookstore and you're just trying to make it through the day without like trying to gain some confidence about yourself. And it's like really short but it's also kind of subtly about gentrification because Queen Street West is was a really rapidly changing area, and this bookstore is based on an actual bookstore that was like, this is where the creator used to live. And now that bookstore no longer exists. It's like a clothing store now. And so this is kind of like a snapshot of a very specific point in Toronto's history that you can kind of explore through the narrative. And then you also have like political games like Pipe Trouble that's obviously about, well, it's not Toronto specific, but it's something that was like in the headlines a lot, so I put it in there about the the tar sands in Ontario. Rob Ford was our infamous mayor who is recently out of the spotlight, but our cocaine snorting mayor. A burst of games came out around that time that were about his his adventures, for lack of a better word. And there was also like someone made a Civilization 5 mod where you play Rob Ford is one of the leaders, and like it was like it had all these in-jokes about the way he runs things. A call center game, but the guy worked for the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency in Toronto. That's not really set in Toronto, but it's a good game as well. This one, I'll just like wrap it up with Cyclopath. It's a game that my friend made about the danger, like what it feels like to be a cyclist in downtown Toronto, and it's really scary. And our taxis have these like bright orange and blue color schemes. And this is like the logo for the TTC, which is like our subway system, and so TTC logos will come and fly in and like bats and try to kill you. And so like you could apply cycling in any busy downtown area can be scary, but like those little clues really help sell, like, oh yeah, this is like about my hometown, and like games can be made about as a personal expression about something that I feel about my environment. And it doesn't have to be like some fantasy world or some like big anonymous city that is probably New York, but it doesn't matter. Like, and so I get people to do like activities like think about how you navigate the city as a cyclist or a pedestrian or a transit person, and like how would you change Cyclopath to reflect your own experiences. And yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. I could go on longer about like, because I talked to someone from like LA who was talking about like what the game community is like in LA, and it's pretty different from Toronto, like way more like spread out and like not as much collaboration. So that web that I showed with like connecting all the people and everything, from what he was saying, it sounded like LA's would be a lot more like, I think there's some people that do indie game stuff, but I don't know if I know about them. Like, it's like a little more, the connections like aren't necessarily, there might not be as many of them. So like, that's a conversation that I want to have with more people about like, what's the game community like where you're from? And like, let's compare notes. And I think that would be really cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Oh wait, right. First. The video's right there. The video's here. Yeah, something this one, so you can just switch.
Well, hello. My name is Edgar, and I'm sorry I'm not from my right but I'm here and I'm actually from Chihuahua, Mexico. Chihuahua, yes, like the dog, and no, the dogs are not from there. And it's right here. It's actually this state. It's the biggest state in Mexico. And first of all, I really, really, really wanted to talk about the gaming developer community in Chihuahua, but there's 4 guys, so it's non-existent. Well, 4 companies, right? It's me, or us, which are actually like 10 guys, and then there's another guy that works in my building that's called Non-Fictional Games, and he's doing a really cool game, and then there's another guy who does like mobile games for Nokia, and that's it. So there's like none at all. So these are some games we've made. These 2 games were made for like a fair, and it was a game lab type of deal. So we got a lot of elementary schools, and you could play. You could play with your hands, so a camera tracked your movement, and you move the bird around. And Octus Lab, we actually used Makey for it. So you would like use fruits and clay and whatever. And then these 2 are for mobile devices. And then this was done for a food chain called America's Incredible Pizza, which there's one in Chihuahua, and it's for web development, and it was a real hassle because the owner wanted to like do a lot of stuff that wasn't really fun, and he limited us a lot. And then we did this one for a museum, and it's really cool because it's like an educational game, and it's a voyage through the galaxy, the solar system. And you have a bunch of kids in front of a big screen that see this, and they move around, so the spaceship goes like this or like that. And then you have like a lot of information popping up about the planets and all of that. And then in the back, there's 3 modules of kids answering trivia questions with cards, and the success of those kids like boosts up the ship's defenses or stuff like that. So it's like a teamwork thing. And after that, we said, you know what, we're done doing games like as a service, because it's a real hassle and people don't pay, and like it's really like bad. So we started trying to get this done. We actually founded, the answer was 3 guys, to do games that were not like mainstream games. We wanted to make games that said something and that meant something, and not have to like go to the old and reliable sources of like shooters or platforms or regular platforms and stuff like that. So we wanted like more of a challenge, and boy, did we get it. So these guys are the Raramuri or Tarahumara, and it's an actual tribe that lives in Chihuahua and that state, and they actually go up to Texas a little bit. And they still live in our hometown. If you go to Chihuahua City, you're going to see them walking around. And if you go to the Sierra, which is a really, really cool tourist hotspot, you should go. You see them still living like in their huts and making their crafts and all of that stuff. And the deal is they get like a lot of discrimination because people see them in the streets and they think they're hobos or like they're peddlers or they don't have no education and stuff. But they're actually really intriguing and interesting. They have this thing where they can run for like hours and hours and hours, and they actually broke a record, and there's like a documentary in National Geographic about them. They can run like for like 20-something hours non-stop and barefoot and all of stuff like that. They have this concept called Korima, and if you see them, if you ever go to Chihuahua and they go up to you and they say Korima, which is they're asking for money, but Korima actually means share. So they have no concept of owning stuff. So for them, owning something is like, it virtually doesn't exist in their vocabulary. What they do is they have Korima, which is to share what I will not use. And they have a lot of this type of stuff that's really cool. Like for example, kids, they are in charge of cattle and big stuff since they're like 7 years old to like get responsible and stuff like that. So we wanted to share this culture with everybody through a game. And these are the basically the first like concept arts deal that we wanted to do. And this is how I started pitching the game to like government and tourist organizations and cultural organizations. Like when we started doing this, we like, dude, we hit the jackpot. I mean, everybody's gonna have to want to be a part of this, and they're gonna throw money at our faces. It's gonna be no problem, right? Wrong. So wrong. Okay, so at first it was like, yeah, we know that Raramuri. We've been to the Sierra like 100 times, and we know what we're doing. And then we started visiting like actual organizations and anthropologists, and we got really smacked around because we were like way in over our heads. For example, this stone is called the Rusigwari, which they believe in, and it's a stone that sucks your soul if you don't ask for permission to use it. It's kind of weird, but yeah. And you actually find this stuff in the library. Oh yeah, quick thing. When we started doing the research, we found that the internet doesn't know anything about the Raramuri. And it was really important for us to show the Raramuri in their best spotlight. So that was way before the colonization, and way before the Spaniards got here and made a mess, right? So there's no info on that at all. So we had to actually go to a library and actually take up like books and like shoot the dust off and read them, and it was kind of interesting. This is some more concept art. That's the Rusigwari right there, and then some sketches about the main character. The main character's name at first was going to be Kombamiai, because that was the only name we found on the internet. But then digging through, we found out that Kombamiai was a chief that burned the first church and started the revolution with the Raramuris. And then we're like, okay, no, that's way too ahead. And then we found out about another guy called the Mulaka, which the only thing that's said about him is that he was a really like honorable chief, and he was really truthful and brave and wise, and okay, we'll take that name. And then like months ahead, we found out the meaning of Mulaka, which is a start, like corn start, the little tube where the corn comes out of. And this is more concept art. And then at this point, which was like maybe 3 months of development, we're gonna do this, we're gonna pitch this to everybody, we're gonna have to decide from whom we take money, and we went to all of these guys. Okay, so all of these guys are like big budget companies and organizations, right? First of all, the Institute for Culture, which takes care of all things cultural in the state. And they said, wait, video game? No. Ask me for money to paint stuff, or ask me for money to like put a play, or ask me for money to do cultural stuff. Video games are not cultural. Get out of here. Okay. So we went to Conaculta, which is like the chief of them, and that's like nationwide. And we kind of got the same answer. And then we went to CDI, which is actually the Commission for Indigenous Tribes of Mexico, because there's 62 indigenous tribes still living in Mexico. And, well, same answer. And then we went to Achihuahua. Achihuahua, it's like the tourist branch of the government. And we were like, yeah, we can put your hotel in there, and like guys can click and please give us money, we'll do whatever. And we got the same answer. Alas y Raíces is actually the fair for which we did the game lab. And they said, well, it's a lot of money. And we said, well, yeah, it's game development. And they said, well, ask me for less money. And then, okay, give me whatever. And then they told me, okay, but you have to give me something with that amount of money. And I was like, oh, well, that's easy. We have art books and we have concept art, which you can use in whatever. And they didn't go for it. And then the Christensen Fund is actually a fund on San Francisco that deals exclusively with Raramuri. Funny thing, there's like 3 organizations that help out the Raramuri, and none of them get money from Chihuahua. I don't know why. But yeah, we pitched to them too, and they said like, okay, this is really cool, we believe in games, and then, but there's the matter of precedent, and we have never, ever, ever given money for software development of any kind, so no go. Cool. This is how do you call it? It's like the IRS type of deal, Economy Office Bureau of Mexico, and they were all for it, and they have strung us along since October, like, yes, you're gonna get all the money from us, don't worry, we'll see you next week, and along it goes. And so far, no one. PACMIC, it's actually an organization that deals exclusively with tribes who are losing their native tongue. And our game is narrated all in Raramuri. And we went to them and they said it's too much money, and then the same thing as those guys. These guys are a foundation from Monterrey, Mexico, which is northeast of Mexico. And again, they give money and they do stuff exclusively for the Raramuri. They have 0 pesos, 0 money from Chihuahua. These guys actually are really interested, but we tried cold calling and cold emailing because I'm nobody over there, so nobody knows me. And we just got their attention a week ago. So we're still hopeful with them. INADEM, FECHAC, and ProSoft are different funds that give money for entrepreneurs. But they only give money to buy stuff. They don't give money to pay hours, salaries. And we have all we need in terms of stuff, so we only need that. So no go. Okay guys, you know what? We're gonna do it ourselves. Screw it. I'm gonna keep asking for money, but it most likely won't ever come. So we started getting in touch with non-government organizations. And we said, you help us out with, I know you can't give me money, but you can maybe introduce me to the tribes and we can get them involved, and I'll give you part of the earnings, if we get this done. And this is the first, travel, right? So these guys, they set up schools and they set up this really cool water stuff. They get water from rain and purify it, and they have water in their houses. This is a guy who has the record for running 26 hours straight. His name is Emilio. That guy is a teacher of Raramuri and a cultural leader in that region, which is called Noragachi. And then we got another travel to Kusarare, and this is some pictures of that, which we went to actually make the Kickstarter video. Oh, that's Emilio. And then this is a more advanced art and design once we have all the information and once we get everything done. And one thing that was really helpful is that we got in touch with this guy called Enrique Servín, and he's a really, really, really respected authority on native languages and native tribes, and he has a bunch of international awards for that, and he writes stories and everything, and he knows gaming, so yay. And which was really cool because the first meeting we had with him, 5 minutes in, he's like, okay, so you want to do a type of Zelda game, but with Raramuri? Yes, please. Oh, finally, after months of trying to explain everything to decision makers and bumping into this was a real relief. So he has given us a bunch of information, and he's on our beck and call. We can just is this true? Did they did this? How do you call that? And then he gives us the information and validation immediately. So this is more art to do with the game. These are actually demigods from the Sierra Tarahumara, and I'm going to show you the video too. But I thought something that I wanted to comment is that every single thing you see in the game has been validated by Enrique Servín and other 3 anthropologists. So because it's really important for us to really show the culture for what it is or what it was, because we're trying to rescue that. I mean, it's not only to make a cool game, it's make a cool game so you get to know these people, and so people have another medium to access their information. So that's what we're trying to do. And then if we are successful with this, we'll go with another culture and then another culture and another culture, because there's a bunch of them. And then I should show you. Nope.
Sorry.
It's right here.
Have it?
Right there, right? Yeah. So this is actually
I think you just opened the PowerPoint and not the video. It's right.
Oh,
middle.
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's around here somewhere. I know it.
Yeah.
Yes. So, this is actually the Kickstarter video, which we got really hopeful for because, okay, once we hit Kickstarter, people are going to know about this. All of Mexico is going to be behind us. We're going to get this done. So wrong. But anyway, here's the video and some images too. What you hear is actually a Raramuri talking. His name is Makawi. Okay. Yeah, it's not done, obviously. And then that's me explaining everything I just explained to you, which I won't do again, with a haircut that doesn't really do me any favors. But yeah, you can see the actual like interviews and visits and stuff like that. So to sum up, we have struggled a lot to get funding for this game, mainly because of the taboo that exists not only with video games but with software development in our region, which is northern Mexico. We have the fortunate to be one of the most open-minded communities in all of Mexico. I've talked and I've worked with some people southern Mexico, and over there it's even worse because they're like, "Oh, really? You're gonna help me out? I'm not gonna have to pay you any money to send that email to that guy." Because in my hometown, you do have to pay money just for an email contact or whatever. And over in Chihuahua, we're like, "No, man. I mean, it's no problem, you know." Which is really, really cool for us and really sucks for them. But with this, with the Kickstarter campaign, we've gotten a lot of press. I mean, national press, big deal stuff. We're an IGN and stuff like that. But nobody donates. Absolutely nothing. Because people are really afraid, and this is a true story. A lot of people have called us up and I want to give you money, but I don't want to put my credit card number in it because I'm gonna get in trouble and stuff like that. So where can I meet you and give you the money like that? And we're talking about maybe $200, right? $200, and I'll give it to you. No, dude, just it's really safe, you know. HTTPS means that it's okay and all of that. So we didn't see that coming. Having to educate people about crowdfunding and gaming at the same time. So yeah, it's not going really well, but we have gotten all these other deals with all these other organizations, and we really hope to get it done. And if you have any more questions about the game, I'm actually at the arcades booth over there, and you can take a postcard or my cards or talk to me, and I think that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Edgar. That was great. We are so fortunate to have all of you with us. All right. So we have a bit of time for Q&A. We're coming up on lunch after this, so we can bump into that just a little bit, because we only have 5 minutes, and we want to talk about 15 for Q&A, just so you know what the situation is. So.
Should we sit right there? Maybe put some chairs?
Yes, actually. Thank you. That's a good idea. Yeah. I guess I was going to kick off with a question that any of the three of you, if you have strong feelings about it, just take it away. I was just going to ask about where a culture of game development might emerge from, whether you could say it comes from state support of certain types of education, state support of the arts, individuals doing community building work, any kind of, if you have any insights about that.
I don't actually know too much about the business side of how games are made in Toronto because a lot of the games that I make they're not really commercial and they're kind of artsy and weird. So a lot of the people that I know get government grants and stuff like that. But as you can probably see from my slides, I'm a big proponent of, and this is kind of reflected in how game organizations in Toronto spring up. So Hand-Eye Society, so we had the IGDA, and that was kind of the only game in town, so to speak. And Hand-Eye Society kind of got founded by people who were like, IGDA is great, but like they're kind of industry focused, and we want to do more like non-commercial, weird, artsy-fartsy games. And so they branched out and did like Hand-Eye Society, and then so they did Difference Engine Initiative because they believed like the whole diversity in games mandate, and they looked around and it was like maybe 1 or 2 women doing games at that time. So then, they did a Difference Engine Initiative, and then Dames Making Games came directly out of that program, and so you can kind of see this like leapfrog of people like, if there is a need that is not being filled, then just branch off and create it and like do your own thing, and then we can still keep in contact with like the organization that you came from and like do stuff together, but like it's useful to have like all these like different little organizations. So that's kind of like how I see it going over there.
Well, in my experience, it's kind of I like to say that Chihuahua is like the Wild West, or even northern Mexico is like the Wild West because there's nothing there. So you create everything. And then once you start creating stuff and getting out there, you get a lot of people like interested in your stuff. And it's really easy, at least in my experience, to get that community going because it's just like, okay, why don't we get together all Saturdays and talk about stuff and see what you're doing. So in my experience, it's been really easy because there's nothing there. It's like people that are hungry for game development. Because Mexico is like the number 13 country, last I checked, in game consumption, but we don't produce like anything. So people are really, really hungry for that kind of stuff. And as soon as it starts popping out, they just leech onto it. So it's really cool.
Yeah, like in the 80s, like most of this development came out of computer hobby. But like these days it's a little different. There's a lot of people, a lot of sort of small groups and companies are being founded by people from technical schools, graduates of technical schools and graduates of computer science. And I think quite often what they're struggling with is getting good designers. So they have the skills, but they sort of are looking for ideas or somebody to design or like to sort of provide some kind of content or something, some kind of creative spark. And people from sort of other arts and media don't seem to communicate that well with these programmer types. So I think that's sort of something that needs some kind of infrastructure to work. And I think there have been some attempts to do that. I think it's a very important thing to have this bridge between programmers and artists, whatever. Yeah, and there are some projects that have been funded by the state, and actually a game called Czechoslovakia 3989 is being exhibited here at in the arcade, and that was made at Charles University as well. I mean, I know I didn't work on that game, but I know the people who followed the development. And that's a game about it's sort of like a similar project to what you're working on. It's a project about it's a game about the history of the country, and it's sort of like an adventure game, which is sort of like Walking Dead kind of style adventure game in which you make these choices that can affect your future. And that was supported by the Ministry of Education.
Thank you so much.
All right. I noticed that you had a great web for Toronto, all these different collaborations, and that extends among different communities. I'm really curious about the ethnic diversity within those communities.
So like, as I said, there's like a lot of organizations and people like doing stuff, but there's like a lot of overlap. So when one group has an event, like a lot of people from like all other groups come to that event. So you kind of see like the same people over and over again. So I'd have to say like it is pretty, white male dominated. And that's why stuff like Difference Engine Initiative came up, because it was trying to like counteract that sort of thing. In terms of ethnic diversity, so when we went out to Scarborough and partnered with Art Stars, it was like totally different shift. So like all of a sudden it was like all people of color. There was like no white people, except maybe the cop that showed up one time. It was like really weird. He was like checking things out. He was looking for someone, and we're like, this is like a room full of kids playing video games. Get out of here. So yeah, there was like, and like usually I notice like anytime someone who was a person of color showed up at Game Curious, they were coming in from Scarborough, like they were coming in from outside the downtown core. So that was like, so then once they're at Game Curious, I try to like be like encourage them to go to the other events as well. So if like they're interested and they're hooked, then like here are all the other things that you can participate in. But yeah, it is kind of like a sort of recurring thing that like either they live, it's sort of like the dividing line is such that they're like living so far away that they never even hear about these events, or they don't feel comfortable at those events for a lot of different reasons. So like I feel like Game Curious is kind of, I would like to see more of those initiatives acting as sort of a bridge where it's like that is a space where people can feel comfortable, and you can either like just keep coming out to those events forever and that's going to be awesome, we're going to have a great time, or you can like go out and go to these like other events where they would like really benefit from having you there, because you know it's like no fun when like everyone is like the same type of person and the same sort of content is being generated from that. So yeah, it's definitely like a challenge that I've noticed, and maybe people don't always notice just because they're like used to doing the same sorts of things over and over again. But then if you point it out to them, it's like, oh yeah, there's like not a lot of diversity here. And they're like, oh yeah, maybe, but like how do I fix that? And then like now with Game Curious, you do have some like strategies that you can give them to be like, well, this is how you can like sort of address that issue.
We can take one more before lunch officially begins.
My question is for Jaroslav. You talked about kind of recovering this quote-unquote forgotten history of game development in Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic / Slovakia. And I'm just wondering, like, when you say forgotten, like forgotten by who? Like, what is the relationship? Like, who's your work for? And do Czechs themselves know about this history, or has it been totally eclipsed by, you know, the American, Japanese hegemony? Or?
Yeah, people back home, they sort of know that something was being made, but they don't think it's important, right? Because like they didn't really, go down and into history books, about games. So there is, what I've been doing is I've been publishing pieces of my research in magazines, in gaming magazines. And people are rediscovering this through magazines, and it works. Like I got a lot of responses, even from people who were participants in this scene in the 1980s. So I think that would be my audience as well. Like people there should sort of be self-confident about their history of game development, but also from people outside of those contexts. I think it's important to see like how different they involved in different places. But quite often, like what I get to hear is that even the people who had made the games that I was showing, they were like, these weren't good games. Why should we remember them, right? But I think that it's quite often like much more interesting to look at bad games than good games. They can tell us a lot about how it worked back then and how people were thinking about games and some of the limitations they had. So I think like it's really worth it to preserve and talk about bad games as well.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
Expand more on.
I'm just really interested in what the different engine does.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I'll take this back.
Oh yeah.
Sure. I've never been using it.
That's okay. Most of my interest is in the analog game industry, and
it was a great one.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Yeah, we do various pieces, but I mean the question is,
still running? Sorry? The
Kickstarter is still running?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's going to be ending like in 1 week, 2 weeks or something.
Is one that I've
but
always
since we're developing
Yeah,
the
so
Kickstarter is running in the US. Brothers information. If it gets done, we're actually only gonna get like 40% tax. At this point, we're like, okay, we hope it doesn't make it. We can like focus all that money to Indiegogo.
Because I heard from a lot of people that they see Kickstarter as promotion rather than
Exactly.
It's really fun. Yeah, this is Sagan's, right?
Yeah, and you also do things like so a lot of the people that come into Game Curious, like they don't even have internet access or anything like that. They're not going to be on Twitter or Facebook or whatever.
Right.
So it's like, where do you promote?
Well, so the question is like, how do you promote? But then once somebody gets out there, how do you keep them engaged? How do you make them feel like they've got a place there within the community? How do you get them invested in just being, rather than just being a consumer, a creator, or an organizer? Because the consumer doesn't really lend their voice. So like they lend their presence, but they don't lend their voice to the narrative. So the narrative doesn't really shift. They may engage, but then they engage with the heteronormative, like actually white male kind of dynamic, and that's like the stories are being written to them.
We totally have that issue right now with the yes.
Yeah, I'm
with the third Game Curious, it's like these kids all like you're like, what games do you guys want to
We're
play?
gonna
It's
head
like,
over to that room.
Oh yeah.
Oh my god.
Well, yeah, it's frustrating. And then you think about the games, and then you get people that people of color, but they want to reject their own identity, their own ethnic, their the background ethnic identity. And I grew up like that too, rejecting my own until a kind of period. But